When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: Screaming Deal. User: Sandex Surf T. Posted January 8th, 1994.
Anyone who can afford to live at the beach should. There's nothing like waking up in the morning with the sun on your face and the smell of sea spray in the air. My wife Denise and I have been here on the water for going on 15 years now, and we keep trying to convince our friends to come too while the land is, if not cheap, cheaper than it's gonna be in 10 years. So far, we've managed to convince one couple, Greg and Helen, to buy in, and we thought our other friends, Mike and Tina, were a lock, but when they came out to look at property, something happened that soured them on the area for good. If you're going to stay at a motel in our neck of the woods, your choices are either the Seafoam, which is lovely and clean, or you can take your pick of the traps on Tourist Row, which are cheap. When Mike and Tina told us they were coming out, we told them where to book, but when they arrived, they called us from one of the ghastlier spots on the row. The first night, we had agreed to meet at their motel room for a drink before going out to dinner, although that had been when we thought they were staying at the Seafoam. Our house came with a strip of private beach, so we never really go anywhere near the road during the course of a regular day, and the drive to Mike and Tina's motel was a great reminder as to why that's a blessing. Even though the sun was starting to set, the road was still thronged with holiday makers in their barely there swimwear, children running amok. Denise shuddered as we pulled into the parking lot, our LeSabre standing out amongst the beat-up Pontiacs and Fiestas. The wall had been white at some point in the distant past, but time and the elements had faded them to a dull gray. In front of each room was a lawn chair and a small table, atop which sat a brown glass ashtray. It was the kind of place I might have stayed in college during a bender in Cape Cod. Hardly the sort of place you'd expect grown professional adults to voluntarily spend their time. Mike and Tina's room was 15, right in the corner of the complex next to the Coke and ice machines, adjacent to a room that had no number on the door. I raised my hand to knock, but as I did, I noticed someone staring at us from around the side of the Coke machine. I turned to look directly at them, but it wasn't a person, not really. What it was a black face with no features whatsoever, and yet I was sure it was looking at me. My blood ran cold. Was it a costume? A prank? Denise asked what I was doing, and before I could ask if she was seeing what I was, the head withdrew completely behind the machine. I waved her off and knocked on the door. Mike answered, a big grin on his face and a drink in his hand. Their room turned out to be 2 rooms, a suite really, with the dividing wall knocked out and a privacy wall built in the far corner around the bed and ensuite. In our half of the space, there was a kitchenette against the back wall and an L-shaped sectional sofa in the middle, opposite a TV cabinet. I asked Mike how they had ended up here instead of the seafoam, and I heard Tina laughing from the bedroom. Mike laughed too and said that it had been a screaming deal, the kind that was too good to turn down. The rest of the night wasn't anything special. We all went to dinner at the sandbar, then drinks at the jetty. Mike and Tina were excited to go house hunting the next day, and we tried to be as encouraging as possible, since we wanted them here with us rather than the city, which we rarely go out to anymore. We parted just after 11 with a promise to pick them up in the morning. Their motel wasn't any more appealing in the daylight than it had been at sunset. In fact, despite it being a perfect summer day, like we'd all been preserved under a blue glass dome, the motel somehow still managed to look dim. Denise and I had expected them to be ready when we arrived, but instead, Mike opened the door looking bleary-eyed and exhausted, as if he'd been awake all night. I told him he looked like hell and got a weak chuckle out of him. He waved us in and gestured us toward the sectional. Tina, when she finally came out of the room, didn't look much better than Mike, her eyes baggy, her lipstick hastily applied. Thankfully, we were only a few minutes late to our appointment with the realtor, Howard. Some of the properties he showed were everything our friends were looking for, but they just didn't seem all that invested in any of it. A couple times during showings, they would disappear into an adjacent room, their voices dropping to a whisper. I couldn't make out all of what they were saying, but it was fairly apparent they were having a fight. It took me aback because in the entire time I've known them, which has to be more than 10 years, I've never heard them go at it that way. They had fights, of course. Mike would talk about it at poker nights, but never where anyone could hear. After each whisper fight, they'd join us and would all pretend like we didn't know what was going on. After what was frankly an exhausting day of looking at houses, we suggested dinner at La Scala, but they demurred, saying they hadn't slept well the night before and would prefer to make an early night of it. We dropped them off back at the motel where I expected them to quickly head inside, but instead they stayed in the car talking with Denise and I for the better part of half an hour. Not that we minded, they're our friends after all, but considering how insular they'd been all day and how tired they not only claimed to be, but looked, it was unexpected. At length, they sighed and Mike said they should probably go. They were still standing at the curb when we pulled away. In the morning, there was a knock at our door. Imagine our surprise when I opened it to find Mike and Tina there, surrounded by suitcases. If they looked tired the morning before, they now looked like the walking dead. Once we got them and their bags inside, Denise made coffee and we all sat around the patio table. I was about to ask what was going on when Tina started crying and Mike pulled her close. He was the one who told us everything. The screaming deal they'd gotten on their motel had turned out to be more scream than deal. He said that Tina hadn't been all that high on the place from the start, saying she'd felt uncomfortable the moment their taxi had pulled up. Her discomfort had gotten worse when she started seeing what she described as men who weren't all the way there, looking at her from around corners, first outside the room, then inside it. At that, my chest tightened, but I didn't interrupt. Mike had waved off Tina's concerns, saying she was just jet-lagged, but then on their first full night, they were kept awake by what sounded like someone playing drums in the night room. Mike had complained to the front desk, but was told that both rooms on either side of them were empty. The racket had kept them up all night. Worse, around 4 a.m, Tina got up to use the bathroom, and as she sat on the toilet, she felt a finger slide across the back of her neck. It had rendered her a total wreck, Mike said, and they almost hadn't come house hunting with us, but the thought of staying in the room was worse than being out. After we dropped them off, they'd stayed on the sidewalk outside the motel for another half an hour before making their way inside. It was then Mike started seeing the peekers too. They looked like shadows of people, he said, fully formed but with no features. Inside the room, they'd tried sitting on the sofa to watch some TV before bed, but the lights in the room, lamps, overheads, everything kept cutting out, and each time they did, the station on the TV would change to what Mike called some PBS thing with a fat clown and these awful puppets. He said that they could never find the show by channel surfing around the dial. It only ever came up during the power dips. When they climbed into bed, it was more out of frustration than fatigue, and that would turn out to be the worst choice of all. Though they can't say exactly when, each of them independently realized that they were frozen in place. They could make simple sounds, but it was as if every muscle, save for those which moved their eyes, was locked up. For what felt like hours, they watched passing headlights slide across the ceiling until the shadows themselves began to move. Tina seemed to draw further into herself as Mike got to this part, and he himself looked pale. The shadows had seemed to flow up the wall and across the ceiling until they were both looking at a sort of oily pool impossibly hanging there above them. Shapes began to form out of that pool, shining heads, then bodies, dangling closer and closer to where Mike and Tina lay. The limbs of these things were long and pointed, without hands or fingers, and jabbed down into both of our friends, never making contact but producing terrible pains inside their bodies. At intervals, the shadow heads would draw back, looking directly at them with their eyeless faces, and they could see what appeared to be a mouth slowly opening. From it issued an ear-splitting sound of metal grinding on metal, so loud that Mike said he thought he was going to lose his mind. He paused in the telling just then and turned his face towards the sun, like he was hoping its rays might burn away the memories. Mike exhaled a heavy, shuddering breath and said that this went on for hours. The terror, the stabbing pains, the intermittent grinding noises that he came to realize were laughter. He thought they were going to die there, but when sunrise came, the creatures were gone in a blink and they could move. Within an hour, they were packed and without anywhere else to go at our door. Mike hugged Tina and drew her closer. I looked at Denise, who was never great at keeping her emotions off her face, and currently it was saying, "These people have lost their minds." Tina could see it too, and before she had to defend herself, I said we believed them. I then admitted I had seen one of the peekers myself when we'd first gone to pick them up, and Tina began to cry again, this time in relief. We put them up in our spare room where they slept the rest of the day. Once they'd rested, we finally had that dinner at La Scala, and it was just like old times until we put them on the plane the next morning. They'd been back in the city for a week before Mike called to say they'd changed their mind about moving. I could hardly blame them.
Subject, The Meadow. User, 35 Nurse No. Posted, August 21st, 1997.
In the days before my grandfather passed, we often heard him talking to our grandmother, who had herself been dead 5 years. At the time, he was dying from gangrene, so we assumed these conversations were hallucinations brought on by blood poisoning. The illness was in his foot, but the rot spread because he refused to have it amputated. "I was born with 2 feet and I'll die with 2 feet," was what he used to say. I still don't know if that's how he really felt or if he was just afraid to face life without one of his feet, but either way, it killed him. The last conversation he had with my grandmother, and the thing that made me wonder if these talks were more than just some kind of induced brain fog, happened on April 2nd, 1983. Grandpa was in the kitchen, where he spent a lot of his time smoking and drinking coffee, and I heard his voice. Usually, when he was having these conversations, he kept his voice low so as not to be overheard, but that day, he was full-on shouting. "Not now, Mary, not now." There was a pause, as if he was listening to a response only he could hear. Then he replied, "Because I'm scared. Is that what you want to hear? I don't know what it's like there, and you say you can't tell me, so I'm afraid." His voice dropped after that, and the rest of the conversation was inaudible. He died the next day. In the years since my grandfather's passing, I've become obsessed with conversations like this and the final words of terminal patients. In my family, we weren't really given the tools to envision better lives for ourselves than what we grew up with, which means we default to either nostalgia for what's past or anxiety about the ultimate future that awaits us all. I suppose this hobby of mine is a way for me to cope with my own fear of mortality and what comes afterward, while I learn to expand my sense of what's possible in this life. Bobby, a nurse friend of mine, recently told me about a patient of hers we'll call Chris. Chris was a relatively young man in his late 40s who had suffered from persistent heart trouble until the organ finally failed him completely. During this whole process, Chris's wife, Maureen, was by his side, trying not to let him see how badly frightened she was by the prospect of losing him. In the hours before his death, Chris, who had started slipping in and out of consciousness, began moving around in bed as if he was uncomfortable. Maureen tried to comfort him, but he would gently push her away. She called for Bobby, who arrived shortly thereafter to see what, if anything, she could do for him. When asked what he needed, Chris kept shifting in bed for several minutes until replying, "I'm trying to get over." "Over what?" Maureen asked. His reply was casual, almost as if the answer was obvious and didn't need to be asked. "To the other side." Bobby understood immediately, but Maureen either didn't or couldn't take in what her husband was saying. "To the other side of what, Chris?" "To the other side of this place." Bobby spoke up then and asked a question of her own. "What's over there, Chris?" "No more pain. No pain at all." Chris kept shifting in bed until he worked himself around to the point his legs were hanging over the edge of the bed. He hadn't been mobile in a few days, so both Bobby and Maureen were concerned about him falling, but Chris was apparently insistent that he wanted to stand. With a lot of effort, he got to his feet, leaning his head back and taking deep breaths. At length, he sat back down and bent forward until his head was resting on the bedside table. A moment later, he sat up and said, "Okay, I'm ready." Bobby had to call for another nurse to come help her maneuver Chris back into bed, as his energy was completely spent and he could barely move under his own power. Together, they picked up his legs and swiveled him back into place as he lost consciousness. 45 minutes later, he was gone. He had finally managed to get to the other side. While I won't say the conversations I've heard or had related to me have eased my fear of death, they did mitigate it to some degree until I had a close call of my own. I'll spare you the details except to say that, like Chris, I have or had problem with my heart. It's a defect that runs in my family, and I had thought it skipped my generation until I collapsed on shift and had to be rushed into surgery. The surgeon who worked on me was a master at what he does, and I've not only recovered fully, but the faulty equipment pumping away in my chest is now permanently repaired. The cost of this was that I died for 5 seconds on the operating table. It was unavoidable, not the surgeon's fault at all, but in that 5 seconds, I experienced something. Prior to this moment, I was completely under anesthesia and had zero recollection of anything after hearing the nurse starting to count down from 10, but then I came from darkness into the light of a beautiful meadow. High above me, the sky was the most incredible azure blue I'd ever seen, and I was surrounded by tall flowers. Their petals were yellow and red and white and softer than silk. People were there too, maybe a dozen of them standing around me. Their faces were out of focus, but I felt comfortable with them as if I'd known them a very long time. Before I had time to think about any of this further, it was all gone and I was waking up in the recovery room. Whether what I saw was truly a life after this one, the same place Chris was trying to get to, or just the desperate creation of a dying brain, I don't know. What I do know is that I'll keep collecting conversations like the ones I've described above, which are a fraction of a much larger library, until the time comes when either I'll be delivered into eternal darkness, my consciousness blinking out of existence, or I return to the meadow and find those who went before me.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.